Champaign County Agriculture Today with your host, Dennis Riggs.
Hello and welcome to Champaign County Agriculture Today. My name is Dennis Riggs, your host for the next few minutes as we explore the history of one of the exciting industries here in Central Illinois, and that is agriculture. I know a lot of you see agriculture maybe from your back porch, maybe from the interstate as you drive through, but agriculture is such an important industry for us that we thought it'd be interesting to go back and take a look at what has brought agriculture along throughout the years. More specifically, the educational and the organizational side of agriculture. The land-grant universities, the ag organizations that guide and direct the future of the industry. So with me today are two experts in that field. They're all going to help us explore the history of the past. And first of all, we have Harold Geither. And Harold is a retired professor of agricultural economics at the University of Illinois and now an agricultural consultant. Harold, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
And we'd also like to thank Dan Leifel. Dan, who is a amateur historian. And I'm going to ask him what the difference is between an amateur and a professional historian pretty soon. An author and a retired lawyer. Dan, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
I need for folks just to have a quick history of what brought you to this point, an introduction about your background, where you grew up at, that type of thing, Dan.
Well, I grew up in Rockford and came down here to college, actually, at Illinois State. But then I did marry a gal who lives in Normal and who is from Normal, but whose family grew up and is centered around the Ogden, St. Joseph area. So we do have some ties to agriculture in Champaign County.
And I understand worked in ag organizations.
And then, of course, yes, I worked for 27 years with the Illinois Farm Bureau.
Very good. And Harold, tell us about your background, where you grew up, and your educational path.
Well, I grew up on a small livestock and grain farm in Bureau County. Served in the Navy about 14 months at the end of World War II, and then came to the University of Illinois. After graduating with a bachelor's and master's degree, I worked in St. Louis for 6 years, returned here to the faculty and finished a PhD program and served on the faculty in agricultural extension and in agricultural economics for 39 years.
Well, Harold, for you to have that job, they had to create the University of Illinois. I mean, it just didn't happen. Somebody had to get it started. Give us a little bit of history about the University of Illinois and how it got started.
Well, public policy certainly has had a major influence on the development of agriculture, not only here in Illinois, but all over the country. And it was education and research combined that has probably provided the advancements that we have in our agriculture today. Probably a major landmark legislation, of course, was the Morrill Act, which created the land-grant university system, providing land grants to each state to create a college, a school for the common people, the children of the working people. Agriculture and mechanical arts, it was called in those days. Actually, it was agricultural and engineering. And from those land-grant universities, of course, have become some of the major educational institutions in every state across the country.
What year did it actually, was it the same for all college, land-grant colleges?
The Morrill Act actually was passed in 1862 and signed by Abraham Lincoln. The states, of course, with the Civil War going on, took some time to provide the implementation of this act. In Illinois, it was 1867. When the University of Illinois, the decision was made by the legislature to locate our land-grant university in Champaign County. And every state through the years following the Civil War made the decision as to where their land-grant university was going to be located.
Dan, as you look back at history and watch this development of these colleges across the U.S., are there some interesting things that occurred that caused some to lag behind others, or give us some history behind that?
Well, let's talk about Illinois. I'm fascinated with the decision to locate a land-grant college here in Urbana, Champaign, and what became Champaign. The fact is, the legislature was kind of torn between locating in a new campus or adding it to Illinois State University, which began in 1857. But they decided, since you're teaching teachers in Bloomington, or what was North Bloomington, that you do the agriculture someplace else. So that's how it came to be in, or at least one of the reasons it came to be in Urbana. And of course, I must add that by the 1860s, Champaign County was a very important county in this area of the state. It was a politically very active, and of course, Abraham Lincoln practiced here. But I do want to tell one story, and I told this story at a Farm Bureau annual meeting one time, and I'll tell it here and let everybody get mad at me. But when the Morrill Act was being debated in Congress, of course, there were a lot of other things going on at the time, but several representatives fought a fellow primarily by the name of Ezra Cornell. Cornell actually was the national leader. Cornell University is a strange duck in and of itself. It is the land-grant college in New York. However, it is a private college that has with it a state agricultural school. It's the only one like that in the country, so it's kind of Ivy League. It is Ivy League, but it has that condition. But the story is this. When the proposal went forward to create universities or university courses that would teach farmers, there were many people who said, you just can't teach farmers anything. I said that at a Farm Bureau meeting, and I expected to get some hoots and stuff, and some woman raised her hand, and I believe she was a farm wife, said, that hasn't changed. I don't know if that's true. I don't believe it's true, but that was one of the interesting arguments against the land-grant college system.
I understand. Well, here at the University of Illinois, there's an area called the Morrill Plots, and Harold, give us a little bit of the history behind that. It's been around for a long time.
In 1876, a professor of, I guess we would say, agronomy, started the practice of planting, finding out how long corn could be grown year after year. So they had the three types of plots. One continuous corn, one a rotation of corn and oats, which was a major crop at that time, and then a rotation of corn, oats, and hay. The rotations have changed a bit through the years, but those plots continue at that same location. There are not as many of them as there were in the beginning. Some of them now have been turned over into putting buildings on them, but the original plots are still there. There's still a portion that's had corn every year since 1876. Instead of corn and oats, now it's a rotation of corn and soybeans. And I think there still is one that has a 3-year rotation. I'm not sure exactly what they're doing with that. But that is the longest standing experimental plots in the country. There is a plot in England, as I understand, that started a little before that, but it is a very national historic landmark today.
And research is still gained from that plot, I understand.
Well, to some extent, but there's a lot more research plots going on farther south on the South Farm.
I understand. Well, Dan, let's talk about the education of farmers and the organization of farmers. As farmers became more educated, they need to be organized to do things that they couldn't do by themselves. Give us a little bit of a history of ag organizations in Illinois.
Well, you can't separate the movement that eventually resulted in the various farm organizations without the Extension Service. The Extension Service was the way in which the agricultural colleges reached out to the actual practicing farmers, and once we developed a cadre of people who are university trained and understand that this is a time when universities were beyond the reach of the vast majority of people, and a very small percentage of the population was educated at that level. The persons who were then went out and tried to teach these new methods, these scientific methods, to farmers. And during the second half of the 19th century, this was done through things like the Grange, which was just then developing as a semi-social, semi-professional organization, and numerous other organizations, and when you had an agricultural advisor in a county or an extension person in the county, they would organize institutes called Farmers Institutes where people would be encouraged to come in and learn how to farm. Well, some people thought they already knew how to farm, but lo and behold, now this is new science, and I might add a lot of those farmers were like me. They're scared, afraid of change, and so they didn't come in. But through the efforts of some very dedicated professionals, mostly from the University of Illinois, the idea of applying science to agriculture started to take root, literally, and then. Those people who were out giving the scientific method realized that you needed an organization that would give the actual farmers a buy-in to what was going on, and also a political voice. And that led in the just before the First World War to the formation of county organizations, which were actually sponsored by the government. There's something called the Smith-Lever Act, where the government agreed to give grants to organizations that could raise a few hundred or a few $1,000s locally in order for them to go out and hire these agriculture advisors. And then those organizations eventually, which were again fostered by the farm advisors, eventually evolved into Farm Bureau, which of course became a major spokesman for farmers throughout the Illinois and the country.
Well, Harold, you worked as in ag extension for some years.
Actually, when the Smith-Lever Act was passed in 1914, one of the requirements of the federal law was that there had to be a local organization to support the extension work in that particular county. And so basically, Farm Bureau had its birth as the supporter of the local support, farm support for extension. And it was through that effort then, as the counties organized, the states set up organizations of these county extension Farm Bureau groups, that the American Farm Bureau Federation then was started in 1919. And so that was probably the unique thing about Farm Bureau, was that it began during a period of relative agricultural prosperity. The National Grange, which came earlier, the National Farmers Union, which came earlier, was started during a period of more farm depression or economic difficulties among farmers. Farm Bureau started as an educational organization and as support from various agricultural groups. And the first Farm Bureau was actually started in Binghamton, New York in 1911, preceding the passage of the Smith-Lever Act.
But unfortunately in Binghamton, I think it was Bingham County, it was a part of the Chamber of Commerce.
Well, really?
Which is kind of an interesting connection. But otherwise, what Harold says is exactly right. And in fact, in most counties, and some they'd broken away by that time, but in most counties until 1954 in Illinois, the extension advisor was also the head of Farm Bureau, or the operating head, the manager of Farm Bureau.
As the organization matured and farmers, their needs to produce the crop matured, there was also a need for support structures for fuel, for electricity, and many times we refer to these as rural co-ops. Dan, can you give me a little bit of a background of these co-ops and how they got started?
Well, certainly. Farm Bureau was important in that movement, but the cooperative movement actually predates Farm Bureau. The first president of the Illinois Agricultural Association, which is the Illinois Farm Bureau, was himself, Herman Danforth from over in Tazewell County, was himself a leader in the cooperative movement. He served as president of the Illinois Farm Bureau for about 6 months and then moved on to become president of the St. Louis Bank for Cooperatives. So there already was a mechanism for encouraging cooperatives. The cooperative movement itself started in this country in the second half of the 19th century. But as agriculture mechanized, needed more and dependable equipment and fuels and inputs, seeds, and that sort of thing, farmers started to get together, and Farm Bureau did encourage the movement, and formed locally owned, locally financed, and locally controlled organizations that would go out, buy products, and sell it to the farmer, or eventually, of course, take the product, grain, and market it. And the cooperative movement actually extended into areas that we today would probably think strange. There was an effort cooperatively to teach farmers how to keep track of their books. And there was, of course, an auditing association that audited cooperatives. And a bunch of other organizations from soup to nuts, from eggs to purchase of seed and about everything the farmer needed. And then, of course, in the 1920s, that effort went into mutual insurance companies and provided insurance products to farmers also.
The ag organizations have changed and matured as time gone along. Harold, how about the university? How has it changed as an agricultural research arm over the years? You've seen it in your experience.
Well, the sources of funding for research have certainly changed through the years. Federal funding through the Hatch Act dates back to about 1876, preceding the Smith-Lever Act, which supported extension. But federal funding is only part of the sources for research. State legislatures provide funding for research. There is various organizations, companies that provide funding to test and do research, so that research today, not only from agricultural sources, but from such organizations as the National Science Foundation, various other research groups, all combine to provide research and make the land-grant universities some of the major research universities in the country. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, there is this whole program of testing and field tests, and we have a whole series, of course, of research stations across the state. In Illinois, there are 4 or 5 major research fields. There used to be more, but they were small and they've been combined into larger groups. The Dixon Springs Experiment Station in southern Illinois, in DeKalb. There's a northern Illinois research station. There's one in western Illinois. There's one in southwestern Illinois, Brownstown, and over near the John Woods Community College. There's a cooperative effort there between the community college and a research station. So there's cooperative research across the state to provide the information necessary to improve various agricultural practices.
The needs have changed, so the university has changed.
That is right.
Dan, let's take a look at the Farm Bureau organization. How has the needs of farmers changed over the years that you can remember?
Well, it even goes back a little bit before I can remember, but I think the most interesting thing that Farm Bureau has been involved in is the change in the governmental policy. I think Farm Bureau has been most influential in that area because legislators need to know what the farmer's thinking and what the farmer needs in order to produce effective legislation. That's what Farm Bureau's done. And it's kind of interesting. When Farm Bureau started, there was no federal agricultural policy as such. Now, obviously, there were bits and pieces that went together, but nothing integrated into an overall policy. And so the 1920s, and people think of the Depression as beginning, of course, with the stock market crash in October of 1929, but actually the agricultural depression started in the earlier 1920s when the foreign markets collapsed. And there was no adequate response from the federal government, and so there was real pain. And one of the things that developed in the 1920s was the notion that somehow government policy ought to bring supply and demand into balance, and this ought to be a goal of government, and the particular end ought to be to bring the farmers' buying power up to what it was in the 1908-1914 period. That's called the parity period. This kind of government intervention most people would associate with other farm organizations, but it actually developed on the floor of the Farm Bureau annual meeting, then held various places around the state. So the parity concept started in Illinois, and one president by the name of Earl Smith, who was president of the Farm Bureau for 19 years, actually led the fight to get parity for for American agriculture, but he really worked hard for Illinois agriculture. And that program, of course, requires balancing of telling farmers what they can and cannot plant and how much they can plant, because that's how government works. And the Illinois Farm Bureau was closely associated with that until 1945, in which there was a change at the top of the organization, and Charles Schuman from Moultrie County became president of the Illinois Farm Bureau, and almost overnight the position of the organization changed from one of directed agriculture to a desire to have government out of planting decisions and marketing decisions and let agriculture go where it will. If you ask people today, of course, they're more likely to associate Farm Bureau with the later policy than the earlier policy, but they are both present in the evolution of this policy development.
Harold, I know you've watched ag policy over the years. What's your spin on that?
Well, what Dan said is exactly right, but I think a very important development among farm organizations has come about probably in the last 40 to 50 years, and that is the development, and with Farm Bureau support and cooperation, the commodity groups. We today have an Illinois Corn Growers, a National Corn Growers Association, we have a National Wheat Growers, we have a National Pork Producers, we have a National Beef Association, National Cotton Growers. Every commodity has their own commodity groups. And an important development has been farmers willingly contributing to what is called a checkoff program, and the money that has been developed, soybeans particularly is another one. The checkoff money is providing the funds to promote the markets and the uses of these commodities, not only in this country but abroad. And part of the success of our export program has been some of these market development programs sponsored by farmers' contributions to programs that have expanded the markets around the world for some of our major commodities.
And just to add to what Harold's saying, which is of course exactly right, is I doubt we would have the push for ethanol that we have today without 20 years of very hard work by all the farm organizations to foster this development.
Now, has it only been in promotional aspects, or has there been any research or legislative ties to
Well,
this?
some of the checkoff programs have specific goals. When the farmers were asked to vote in a referendum to support these checkoff programs, some of them have been for promotion of the commodity, some have involved research, so depends on the commodity as to how those funds are used. But a major push has been to expand the markets for these commodities. And some cases they are supporting research. The soybean checkoff board, as I understand it, does support a lot of research, not particularly on increasing production as much as disease prevention and weed control and many other aspects of improving the efficiency of production.
Dan, many of our people listening today are not farmers. They're listening because they are consumers of agricultural products. The history that we've talked about in farm organizations and land-grant universities, has it made agriculture better for the consumer?
Well, I don't think there's any question, but it has. Where would we be without the most productive agriculture in the world? We tend to look at oil, and we look at other things we get from foreign lands, but until recently, and I'm sure it's still the case, our number one export was agricultural products. Would those exports pay for our imports? So I can't imagine us being nearly where we are without a strong and effective agriculture, and I can't imagine any country existing at our level for very long without such an industry.
There's some statistics, and I haven't seen the most recent one, but the essence of it says that American consumers, on the average, pay a smaller percentage of their total income for food than any other country in the world. And I think that supports the fact that our agriculture is efficient and our food costs are lower than we will find in many other countries.
And of course, if they're not spending for food, it allows them to increase their standard of living either through health care or disposable items of interest.
Or going on vacation and putting gas in their car.
Or putting gas in their car, too. Hopefully a little bit of ethanol, too. Well, let's take a quick look in just a couple of minutes we've got left, gentlemen. Let's take a little bit of a look at the future. As far as ag organizations and cooperatives, will there ever be need for new organizations, Dan?
Well, again, change is present, and I'm sure change will impact farm organizations. But the day you give up your spokesman in this legislative climate is the day you're about done. I think if we don't have an effective spokesman for agriculture in the legislature, somebody else is going to step in, fill the void, and we may not have the agriculture we have today. So I think it's still essential that these organizations continue their role for the foreseeable future.
I think one of the key successes of the agricultural legislation and the agricultural policy, it isn't just controlling prices or supporting farm income, but it involves conservation, improving environmental conditions. Many of these much of this legislation comes about through the congressional committees, the Senate Agriculture Committee, the House Agriculture Committee, and these are very attentive to the needs of farmers and rural communities, and spokesmen from Farm Bureau and other farm and commodity groups do an effective job of working with their members of Congress and their state legislatures.
What about the research arm of it, Harold? Are there more things to find out? I hope the answer is yes.
Obviously, some of the research today is very technical, very high-tech, but without it, we would not have the quality of agricultural products and the quality of crops that we have today.
As far as the future of the two things working together, as they're beginning, they work together. Do you see universities and organizations continue to work together as well?
Well, one of the last things that happened before my retirement from the Illinois Farm Bureau was they agreed to fund a chair in the the University of Illinois Department of Agriculture. Well, it's not the Department of Agriculture
anymore.
Well,
it's Agriculture and Consumer Economics.
That's
today.
right. But yeah, and the commodity groups have done the same thing. So yeah, that kind of thing is going to happen more and more in the future.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, through your insight of the past, it shows that our history is very unique and blessed, and from your forward looking, it looks like our future is bright as well. So I want to thank you for spending your time with us today. It gives people a little bit of an idea that there's more to agriculture than just what's outside their window right now, but rather a rich history back there.
Certainly is.
Well, thank you for spending the time with us today. And we thank you for listening also. We hope you've learned something from our program today, and hope you'll tune in again next time when once again we have a chance to talk to you about Champaign County Agriculture Today. I'm Dennis Riggs.
Champaign County Agriculture Today is brought to you by Champaign County Farm Bureau.